Today on the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
We have to distinguish between remission and cure. So autoimmune diseases generally are not curable, meaning that they disappear completely and can never come back. But remission is quite achievable, which is where there's really good quality of life, ideally zero symptoms that are bothersome, and sometimes even normalization of lab values as well. So I think healing in terms of remission is definitely achievable.
Well, hello there. I'm your host for today, Dr. Kate Kresge, and we're talking with Dr. Akil Palanisamy. Dr. Akil is a Harvard-trained MD who practices integrative medicine. He blends conventional with functional medicine expertise, including a specialization in Ayurvedic medicine. He's the author of the book, The Tiger Protocol, an integrative 5-step program to treat and heal your autoimmunity. Dr. Akil joins us today to talk about toxins, infections, gut health considerations, nutrition considerations, and nervous system considerations that can change the game if you're trying to heal from an autoimmune disorder. He also gives us hope and proof that it can be done. You'll love today's conversation if you like to stay on the leading edge of medicine, as Dr. Akil now serves as the Department Chair of Integrative Medicine at the Sutter Health Institute for Integrative Health and Healing. He's an incredible teacher and author, as you'll learn throughout the rest of the episode. Before we get started, though, I want to talk to you about something that comes up pretty often on this podcast. And that, of course, is lab testing. You see, testing is one essential way to understand the root cause of an illness. If you're an integrative or functional medicine practitioner, chances are you're placing a ton of orders with a ton of different labs. The Root Cause Medicine podcast is created by Rupa Health. Rupa is the best way to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different labs in one single place for free. Thank goodness. No need to create and log into multiple portals ever again. If you're a practitioner, make sure you go sign up at rupahealth.com to create your free account today. Now, let's start the show. Dr. Akil, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
Thank you so much, Kate. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. So I have your book, The Tiger Protocol, which is the 5-step program to treat and heal your autoimmunity. But before we get started, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about who you are, what you stand for, and what led you to treat and heal autoimmunity using a holistic perspective.
So I practice integrative medicine and also a lot of functional medicine. So I came to integrative medicine through my own health journey when I was struggling with some unexplained health issues. And really the only thing that helped me was integrative and functional medicine. And so that's why I decided to study that and get trained in it. And just with my patients over the past 20 years, I've been seeing like such skyrocketing rates of increase in autoimmunity because there's this perfect storm of factors now that are really disrupting our immune systems. And so that's what led me to write this book.
I'm so glad that you did. And I think a lot of people are going to feel hopeful after hearing us talk today because it's uncommon to hear about someone healing their autoimmunity. So that's actually the first question I want to start with. Is it possible to heal an autoimmune disorder?
I think so. Yeah, we have to distinguish between remission and cure. So autoimmune diseases generally are not curable, meaning that they disappear completely and can never come back. But remission is quite achievable, which is where there's a really good quality of life, ideally zero symptoms that are bothersome, and sometimes even normalization of lab values as well. So I think healing in terms of remission is definitely achievable.
Amazing. And you've written the book on how to do it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So tell us what TIGER stands for. It's TIGER protocol. What do those letters stand for?
So the T is for toxins, which are environmental toxins, and infections. So any different type of microbe that is possible to cause an infection. And G is the gut. So the microbiome and leaky gut, some of those factors. E is eating, so getting the diet really dialed in. And then R is rest, so getting good sleep and managing stress.
And with toxins, you have a line in your book that says, when it comes to toxins, 1 + 1 = 3. What does that mean?
This is some newer research on the synergistic effect of toxins, because that is how they generally are working in the body. All of us, we don't have just like one toxin. So when they've studied people, average Americans, they found at least 100 to 150 toxins in the body that are measurable. So newer research, for example, is looking at the interactions between pesticides and heavy metals and showing that when they are both present, there's a much higher degree of inflammation and cell damage. So we're just learning about some of these synergistic effects with toxins.
So it's like, yeah, when you have one toxin, it might make a new toxin you get exposed to even more potentially damaging. You go through a section of your book where you say even babies are at risk of toxicity. I think a lot of us think, well, I'll get rid of my toxic products or I'll buy an air filter. That it must be my fault, all the toxins I'm being exposed to. But it seems like toxins are just something all of us are going to have to deal with if we are born and live in this world. Is that what the evidence is showing recently?
Exactly, because when they've looked at the umbilical cord blood of babies born in US hospitals, they have found the same 100 to 150 different types of toxins, which unfortunately they're transmitted from the parents. And just as part of the normal development process, they're present. And so, of course, we all have detox organs and things we can enhance the detoxification. But it is true that toxins are something that all of us have to deal with.
And you've studied the science of how to reduce exposure to toxins, how to test for them and how to get rid of them or reduce levels if you have them and just sort of increase your body's resilience. I wonder, what metals do you tend to test for when someone has an autoimmune disorder? And why would a metal have an impact on someone's immune system?
So the heavy metals are a big source of oxidative stress. So they cause inflammation, they cause free radical damage. And then in some cases, there's even, for example, with mercury, some forms of mercury can combine with the human cells and form this like a half human, half metal chimeric cell that is very strange to the immune system. So obviously it's going to attack that. And there are many mechanisms by which the heavy metals contribute to inflammation, which is at the root of all of our chronic diseases, not just autoimmunity. But for testing, I like to do either urine testing through doctors' data, like a provoked urine test, or blood testing. Like sometimes we use Quicksilver Scientific Laboratory for more detailed blood panel for some of the major ones like mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic, the main heavy metals.
And if you find them, what do you find are effective interventions for getting those levels to come down?
So combination of things, we always recommend sauna. So sweating in a sauna, whether it's infrared or dry or steam. Sauna has been proven to excrete heavy metals through the sweat, like all of the ones that I just listed. So that's a proven way. And then we also like to support the liver as well with either glutathione or milk thistle or other botanicals. And then there are herbs that also support detoxification. They have a slightly chelating effect, like a cilantro, chlorella, some of those as well. So those three things together usually.
When people are in the sauna, do you have them make sure they're wiping their sweat off of their skin? Like, is there a risk of reabsorbing toxins after you sweat them out?
Yeah, as long as people shower after the sauna, that's generally the best way, as I don't think it's necessary during the sauna to be worried about that.
So back to implementing some of the real life force that we've got with protecting us from toxins and staying healthy. Some folks feel like they can't get to the sauna reliably. Maybe they can't afford a ton of supplements. Maybe glutathione is even a bit expensive for them. If somebody has a slightly elevated level of metals in their body, what's the most important thing you'd recommend that they do to lower those levels?
If a person can only afford food-based interventions, I think there's still a lot they can do there, like increasing the cruciferous vegetables. Those are excellent for supporting the liver. I think getting fresh cilantro from the grocery store and, you can juice it or try to have a large amount of cilantro. And that's really good. And then beet greens, the leafy tops of beetroot, those are very beneficial for enhancing the glutathione intrinsically that's produced in the liver and also for the bile secretion. So beet greens and beetroot as well. So a lot of foods can support detoxification.
We're doing a fast and furious tour through the autoimmune treatment protocol today. So we're going to move on to infections. What infections in your mind are the most important to screen for when someone has an autoimmune disorder? And even a step further, why would infections even be something you'd think to screen for in someone with an autoimmune disorder?
I think it's because there's well-established research linking infections to both the initial development of autoimmune disease and also exacerbations of autoimmune disease. For example, with the Epstein-Barr virus, there's some connections between flare-ups of chronic Epstein-Barr virus and autoimmune exacerbations. It's found that patients with autoimmune disease tend to have poorer control of their Epstein-Barr virus, like higher titers and more frequent flare-ups. So that's one. And then even other infections like chronic Lyme disease have been tied to autoimmunity. And even with coronavirus, COVID-19, there's some new data that it might be also, like other viruses, be contributing to increased risk of autoimmunity. So I think anything that disrupts the immune system, whether it's bacterial, viral, fungal, parasitic, or archaea, anything like that can disrupt that delicate balance of the immune regulation, which is what is tipped over to cause autoimmunity.
You mentioned the virome, which sounds to me like a viral microbiome almost. What is that?
So just like we have 40 trillion or so bacteria in the microbiome, there are also a very large number of viruses, what are part of the virome. And then with fungal organisms, they call that the mycobiome for the fungal species. So we're just starting to learn more about the virome, and many of these viruses can infect bacteria in the microbiome. So they're closely related to the microbiome. Other viruses are separate, more independent, infecting human cells. I don't think we have really good tests right now for the virome. It's an area of active research. Certainly, it's being studied in terms of what are some of those viral dysbiosis patterns like we see with bacteria are being investigated. I think it's really fascinating. With the viruses, in terms of how I investigate them, typically with a stool analysis, like a GI map, you can look for the basic Epstein-Barr virus or CMV virus DNA in the stool. And so that's one clue. But in terms of testing the broader virome, I don't think we're there yet with really established tests.
Do you think there's clinical utility in testing for things like Epstein-Barr in the blood?
Absolutely. So I typically do test the basic antibody panel, looking at IgM and IgG antibodies, and also early antigen antibodies. So either presence of early antigen or IgM antibodies can indicate more of an active Epstein-Barr virus process. And then I also like to check the DNA PCR to see if there's viral replication going on in the blood that's measurable as well. So I do think if those are present then in autoimmune patients, I think that needs attention to help to get the body to control the Epstein-Barr reactivation.
Let's talk about the approach you'd use to do that, because it's so amazing. I feel like we're not even like halfway through this protocol and there's already so much that people are probably learning. Let's say you find an active infection or you find a chronic infection. What are all of the approaches that you would use to help someone reduce that viral burden so that their immune system can heal?
We always start with herbal or botanical approaches first before going to pharmaceuticals. So that might include things like a monolaurin, which is a coconut-derived antiviral botanical that's really pretty effective against Epstein-Barr virus. So monolaurin is one good option. I also like astragalus because of its effect on boosting the beneficial aspects of the immune system in that case. So humic acid, fulvic acid, some of those components as well are beneficial. And then cat's claw, it's another herb that is significant antiviral activity. And also it has a tonifying effect for fatigue in terms of the post-viral phase. So it's got a couple of benefits there. So usually we try a combination of such botanicals for at least 3 to 4 months and then retest the titers. And then if they're improving, and also symptomatically, if patients feel some changes, then we can continue with those. But if they're not effective, then we would go with the prescription antivirals like the Valtrex or something like that, but monitoring liver function tests and making sure the appropriate blood monitoring is taking place.
So this is probably a good time to mention that you're also trained in Ayurvedic medicine and functional medicine, in addition to your training at Harvard and your residency, because people might be thinking, hang on a second, my rheumatologist didn't talk to me about any of these herbs. But part of that is because you have additional training in herbal medicine. Why did you choose to seek that out?
I felt that, for example, with Ayurveda, there's so much that it has to offer in terms of helping with chronic diseases and also the gut, because in Ayurveda as well, the gut is really the foundation for overall health. And then in the area of the mind, body, spirit, Ayurveda is really strong. They have recognized that connection for millennia, and there's so many tools that are available to help people to improve and regulate those connections. So I just saw a lot of value in terms of what Ayurveda can offer to the modern world. And I found it complementary to many of the other things in integrative medicine I was studying. So that's why I decided to get trained in that.
That leads us to our next part, which is G for gut. There's so much we're hearing about the gut, the importance of the microbiome, leaky gut, an inflamed gut. What matters to you when it comes to the gut and autoimmunity? What do you look at first?
With autoimmunity, there's three hallmarks that have been seen. One is dysbiosis, where there's a overgrowth of harmful pathogens and a decline in the beneficial bacteria. So that's a pattern we're always looking for. And then second is the leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability, which also has been found in a large number of different autoimmune conditions as one of the mechanisms. And then third is a loss of the diversity of the microbiome. So loss of the beneficial diversity, which is a really key metric for the overall robustness of the microbiome. So even if a patient with autoimmune symptoms or conditions doesn't have GI symptoms, I still like to test their microbiome, either Genova GI effects, comprehensive stool analysis, or a GI map stool test, or sometimes we use doctor's data. So there's a wide variety of options there, but I always like to do a deep dive into the microbiome to help guide us with what's really going on.
And what are some natural interventions you'll use depending on what you find? So let's say you find an imbalanced microbiome, not enough good probiotics, maybe some evidence of leaky gut. What are things that people can do about those? Because I think sometimes I run into folks who think, well, I almost don't want to know because maybe I'm going to have to give up all the foods that I love. But it seems like with your protocol, there's a gentler, more evidence-based strategic way you can go about healing your gut.
With food, so that's always part of it. So for example, if we do the GI map, it does include a gluten antibody. So if that's positive, then I'll recommend eliminating gluten for some time and then adding in bone broth for the gut healing properties, adding in fermented foods as well for those beneficial microbes. And then if a person is very low in some of the beneficial bacteria, I like to use prebiotics because I think those have a more lasting impact on the microbiome than probiotics. Probiotics are great for symptoms or modulating the immune system. But then usually after a couple of weeks of stopping taking them, they're no longer present in the stool. So they rarely colonize the microbiome. Whereas with prebiotics, you can have more long-term impact because you're feeding those microbes that are already resident in the GI tract, and you can have more sustained benefit, which is really what we want. So I think often tend to use prebiotics more than probiotics, although I do use probiotics quite a bit as well, but more in terms of a targeted or short-term way.
When you say prebiotics, what do you mean? Because I know you can eat a ton of fiber and that's going to have some prebiotic effects, but are there specific types of prebiotics you use?
Yes, there's many different types depending on what we're seeing on the stool analysis. So, for example, partially hydrolyzed guar gum is a prebiotic made from grinding the guar bean and making a specific, called PHGG. And this is actually used as a treatment for SIBO. So if we're seeing an overgrowth of methane-producing bacteria like methanogens, then we can use the PHGG to help reduce those levels and feed the beneficial bacteria. So it has multiple benefits. I think psyllium husk, plain psyllium, is also excellent in prebiotic effect if there's good data that it raises the levels of multiple beneficial bacteria. Sometimes I use inulin. So inulin is derived from like either artichoke or chicory, and inulin is also a really good prebiotic that feeds a variety of microbes. And many of these prebiotics, they also have metabolic benefits because they're improving blood sugar regulation and sometimes cholesterol as well, because a lot of that is related to the gut as well.
I love that doing one thing that's good for one part of your body can have such profound effects for the other parts of your body. So it's no wonder to me that your patients are healing. Now, your E portion of your Tiger protocol stands for eat right. That can mean so many different things to so many different people. What do you mean when you say eat right?
I like to break it up into the phase 1 and phase 2 diets. So the phase 1 diet, which is the initial phase, that's more of an elimination diet. So depending on testing, perhaps eliminating gluten. Dairy is also a food that many patients with autoimmune disease tend to be reacting to. So often starting with gluten and dairy, and then possibly other categories. We have nutritionists and health coaches in our office that we like to have our patients work with to get a detailed elimination diet and then reintroductions systematically where they're tracking symptoms from reintroducing. And then long-term, the phase 2 diet is more of a general plant-forward diet with a lot of diversity, plenty of different fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds. And if a patient tolerates them, legumes, possibly whole grains. And the key thing is, we try to tell people to have 30 to 40 different plant foods in a week just to really get that diversity built up in the microbiome. And then, of course, animal protein, if the person tolerates it, great. And that can be good as well, getting good quality grass-fed meat or wild-caught fish, pasture-raised chicken, and so forth. Or if a patient is vegetarian, that's fine too. They can have tofu or other sources of protein, and then just maintaining that foundation of plant foods, no matter what, in terms of the animal protein intake.
Why are plant foods so important for people with autoimmune disease to include in their diet?
So that goes back to the third finding in gut autoimmune patients, which is that the decline in diversity is really a hallmark of autoimmune disease. And the way to really rebuild the diversity is increasing the plant food makeup, because every different plant feeds a slightly different blend of microbes. And when they've looked at like ancestral diets, where more like either hunter-gatherers or modern populations that kind of mimic that lifestyle, they might eat like 80 to 100 different plant foods in a month. So just getting a lot of diversity naturally through the diet. And that's hard to do, obviously, now, but at least trying to get it up to 30 to 40 through the foods we have available. And then eating plants you may not normally choose. Sometimes my patients get in a rut where they're just buying the same things, broccoli and carrots every week, and not necessarily like getting some different things that they don't. So like intentionally choosing different plant foods can help with that diversity.
Do you have tips for people who are busy, who might be thinking, I can't cook every day? What are some ways that you have found make it easy to get more variety of plant foods in your diet without having to cook every meal?
A smoothie could work well as an adjunct in that case, where, you can really throw in a little bit of like a bunch of different, dozen different plants, and does not have to be cooked, and, also get some good like protein powder and whatever else, good source of fat as well, nut butter or avocado. And then there you have a complete meal that is relatively easy to and fast to prepare, but it's going to really give you a lot of the diversity in case the rest of the day you're busy and not able to like really eat a lot of different plant foods.
Is there a quick dinner that's your favorite? I found myself becoming a fan of lentil pasta. It has minerals, it has protein, it has fiber. It tastes like the pasta you grew up with for the most part. Are there any hacks that you have for dinners and lunches that make it easier to get vegetables in for plant foods?
Yeah, I also really like the lentil pastas that are out there. I think quinoa is something as well that gotten more patients into. I think it's higher in protein, and then it's a little less starch than regular rice. Some of the gluten-free grains also are quite good, like buckwheat, for example. It can be quite delicious. You can actually make it in a rice cooker, and it tastes really good. So I think just experimenting with different things, and many of these grains can be cooked in a rice cooker. So that way it's fairly easy to prepare. And then you're getting the foods you don't normally eat like every single day.
Okay, last portion of your protocol, rest and rebalance. I'm just going to give you a platform right now because I really loved how you laid this part of your book out. I love that you talked about HRV, but this can be such almost like a lifelong conversation about learning to rest and rebalance. So why did you choose to include that? Why does this matter for people with autoimmunity in particular? Let's start there. And then I want to get to some practical, tactical tips for the busy folks in our audience who this is going to hit a nerve with.
Definitely. I think there's good research for the connection between stress and autoimmunity. So stressful events are associated with the initial development of autoimmune disease many times. It can be like the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of this like multi-step process that leads to autoimmune disease. Often patients tell me like, oh, during this XYZ stressful time was when I finally got diagnosed. So that's pretty clear. And then also stress is associated with increased rates of exacerbations and flare-ups once a person does have autoimmune disease. So the data is pretty strong on that. And whenever I talk about stress, my patients, their eyes glaze over, and they've heard so much about it that it's hard to hear again. But I also really emphasize the importance of healing childhood trauma, because with these ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, there's also good data that significantly increases the risk of autoimmune disease later in life, in adulthood, because of that chronic sympathetic activation, the fight or flight that can be triggered from trauma and then lasts for many years. That's ultimately what has the negative effects that sympathetic state, the fight or flight. So as long as we're balancing that with activating the parasympathetic, then I think we can counteract the effects of stress. And I think sleep is really underemphasized as well, because we know that sleep is really when the body heals itself and repairs and regenerates. And, all of us could do with getting a bit more sleep, I'm sure. But that's really one of the most important things that any person can do for their health is with getting some good quality sleep.
What are some signs to you as a physician that someone is in need of rest and rebalance? Are there vital signs, physical symptoms, cycles that make you start to think critically about rest and rebalancing for this person in particular?
I like to look at the HRV. I think that's a good tool. I think also resting heart rate, it's very simple, but if someone's resting heart rate is in the 80s or 90s, for sure, I'm concerned. But even in the 80s, I feel like that's problematic in terms of their, not just autoimmune disease, but heart health and longevity and all those things. So looking at HRV is a great tool to track that sympathetic parasympathetic balance, and also the resting heart rate as well.
You're saying HRV and we're talking about heart rate variability. How do you measure it? Do you have your clients use an Oura ring or a Whoop strap? And what is a healthy HRV in your mind?
There's many ways to do it. Could be like either of those or their Apple Watch or Fitbit. And then every tracker has a different numeric way that it measures it. And I always caution my patients, though, that with these trackers, we have to be careful to interpret the information properly and not have it cause like stress and anxiety, because that's also something that is problematic. For example, with tracking sleep, there was a study where they actually gave people sham feedback from so-called sleep trackers. They told half the people they had slept really poorly, even if they actually hadn't. And then the other half was told, oh, you had great sleep, even if their actual sleep tracker showed that they slept really poorly. And what they found in that study was the feedback was what determined the person's energy level, their somnolence, their like cognitive functioning during the day. So it can be harmful, because I have a lot of patients who say, oh, woke up feeling great. And I checked my sleep tracker. It told me I had, very little deep sleep and a poor sleep score. And then I just felt depressed and my whole day was ruined. And there's now research documenting that is quite possible. So with all data, you have to take it with a grain of salt and really ultimately rely on your own feelings. How do you feel you slept? Keep a journal. How would you rate your sleep? Those things really, I think, matter more in the end. And you have to really use data appropriately.
People ask me what's a healthy HRV, and I want to pick your brain about that. And I also want to know from you, I find that people in larger bodies who are very tall and the people in male bodies seem to have lower HRV than the small, petite females that I see in my practice. I am so curious if you have seen that as well, because I see somebody come in and they're a big, tall runner. Their HRV is 25. They're super frustrated. And I've started to wonder a bit if we are measuring it wrong sometimes in people who have a bigger body habitus. What's your experience with HRV and what an ideal HRV is?
I definitely think those things do affect it, in terms of the body habitus and so forth. And you also get the HRV score, which is kind of calculated not just based on HRV, but other things. So that could be in the 60s, for example, the Whoop score for each is in the 60s. But with HRV, so many things do affect it. We know diet affects it, sleep, stress. So I think I have seen that as well. Sometimes body habitus can falsely lower the levels. So we use it as a tool, but like anything, I always tell patients, ultimately we're looking to have you rely on your feelings, rely on your personal impression. Any of these metrics are just a tool, but we don't want that to be a substitute for your own judgment, your own feelings. Really want you to be in touch with your body. And I really understand that's the most important thing.
I think of biofeedback as the guardrails for developing your own intuition, because so many of us have become divorced from our intuition and how our bodies actually feel, because we're used to kind of just pushing, even if we're sleep deprived. So it can be really useful to see how your biometrics change with the changes you're making. But I love that you're emphasizing gauging it against how you truly feel. Because I agree. I have the same experience. A client will say, I love my Oura ring, but man, when it tells me I didn't sleep well, I have a rough day.
A lot of those sleep trackers, I mean, the only way to really definitively track deep sleep is with an EEG. In a sleep lab, you'd have to have a bunch of electrodes hooked up to the brain. And that's the only way to be sure about deep sleep and different stages of sleep. Because the sleep tracker is pretty good at estimating like when you fell asleep and when you woke up, just based on movement. But then I don't think the trackers are really there yet in terms of like accurately layering out the different levels of sleep and the amount of deep sleep. That's like a constant source of angst for a lot of my patients. They say, oh, I only got 20 minutes of deep sleep. And I have to explain, that's not true. We can't really rely on that to definitively say that. So I do think there's a lot of anxiety that this gets triggered with the sleep score sometimes.
I agree. I like that you're guiding your clients through how to use it in combination with their own intuition. I'm curious, because you're trained in Ayurveda, you're really familiar with a bunch of these rest and rebalance tools. Do you have any daily or weekly practices that you use to help yourself rest and rebalance?
Yes, I'm a big fan of meditation. I think there's amazing research in that. But I think with Ayurveda, also there's a couple of other great tools. So yoga is really restorative and has been proven to help activate the parasympathetic. And it's more of a movement-based meditation. So that is something that can work for people who are not into the sitting meditation. And then there's also a set of breathing exercises called pranayama. There's like 5 to 6 major different types of pranayama and breathing exercises, where in Ayurveda, there's a whole science of how you can use the breath and change different breathing patterns and frequencies to have different effects, parasympathetic or sympathetic or other indications. So I think that's also another more active way for people who they don't like meditation, but pranayama is also a good alternative in that case.
I love that you said yoga is a moving meditation. I think that's a beautiful way to put that. When I was in practice, I would see a lot of folks who had ADHD or anxiety. It was difficult for them to sit for a while. And are you familiar with the history of yoga? Because I remember reading at some point that yoga was basically a way to almost prepare your body for being deeply present in the moment. Is that what you've learned as well?
Absolutely. Yoga has a whole like mental, emotional, spiritual component that is not widely taught in the West. We've thought of as more of a physical practice, but the origin of it, is much more holistic, really intended to be mental, emotional, spiritual practice in addition to physical, and also to prepare the body to be in the state of presence and mindfulness. So there's a lot more to yoga that's below the surface, but I think it's an amazing tool.
You have dozens of tips in the last section of your book about resting and rebalancing. I want everyone to go get it. If you've got an autoimmune disorder, please, everyone, go get this book. Use it to inform yourself and your team about your options. I think you're going to see a lot of improvement. It's chock full of evidence-based interventions. Dr. Akil, you're on the leading edge of medicine. I've seen you speak before, and I'm curious, what's next for you?
For me, I'm always looking at what is new in the area of autoimmunity, and I'm very interested in fecal transplant, like the changing the microbiome through that. I think there's starting to be some autoimmune conditions where it's being studied, and certainly for inflammatory bowel disease like autoimmune ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, that's pretty clear. But even in other conditions like multiple sclerosis, autism, there's new research coming out, which is pretty promising. So that's an area that I'm really following closely.
Very cool. We will stay tuned to hear what you think about that and continue to learn from you. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you, continue to learn from you?
Through my website, which is drakil.com, or the Tiger Protocol book, which has a bunch of recipes from my kitchen. So I think it's got about like 40 or so recipes. In all my recipes, I always try to include spices because in Ayurveda, that's one of the main branches of medicine and healing. And it's a really simple way to activate, anti-inflammatory pathways, those antioxidants, because studies show like patients with autoimmune disease have higher rates of oxidative stress and lower blood levels of antioxidants. So spices also great for that. Plus all the metabolic and glycemic benefits and microbiome benefits because spices are really prebiotic. So I think that's another thing that Ayurveda really can offer is to the teaching how to add more spices for all of those health benefits.
Beautiful. I want to take a moment. If you have a loved one with an autoimmune disorder, you might be feeling like, I want to feel hopeful and I want to get this book, but I've tried so many things. I bought this supplement 3 months ago and it didn't do anything for me. Tried the psychotherapy and it didn't work. What would you want to say to that person right now?
Autoimmune disease is very challenging. And it's a very difficult condition, and also it's a multifactorial condition. So it would be different if it was like a strep throat or something where you just have to get the right antibiotic and then it's taken care of. But because of the complexity of the immune system, the autoimmune diseases are caused by multiple factors. So you can't just do one thing. Unfortunately, you have to do multiple things, like addressing these different aspects. Toxins and the gut healing, and also stress and sleep. So it does seem daunting, but I think if a person is overwhelmed, I would say pick one and maybe start with toxins, because that is really under-recognized, and just pick that one area to start doing like one or two things to help your body with detoxification. So it is a very challenging condition, but starting just with one or two steps is a good way to begin.
Do you have one story that you could tell of a client who successfully used the Tiger protocol to help them feel better?
Yeah, one of the first patients that I put through the protocol was a nurse from our local hospital who had Hashimoto's, but it was on the borderline where her thyroid TSH was like 6 or so. So her doctor said, there's nothing we can do. Come back, and when your TSH goes above 10, I'll just prescribe you the medicine. Just wait until thyroid fails. But she wasn't satisfied with that, so she sought out integrative medicine, and we found she had some toxins that needed clearing. She had a lot of gut abnormalities, gluten sensitivity, obviously high stress job. So we worked in a number of those areas, and then we were able to actually bring her thyroid numbers, like her TSH, into normal without medication, and also her antibodies normalized and came down to the healthy range as well. And she has done well since then, not needing to go on medication, and also, more importantly, feeling more energetic and losing weight, having those like symptomatic improvements as well. So that was very encouraging.
Incredible. You have so many stories just like that one. And guys, we have barely touched the surface of what's in this book. Every chapter is full of practical, tactical tips that can help you feel better fast. I highly encourage you to go get this book. I look forward to staying in touch with you and continuing to watch the amazing things you do.
Thank you so much, Kate. Enjoyed our conversation.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for listening to today's episode.
We have one quick favor to ask you before you go.
If you loved today's conversation, would you mind leaving us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on right now?
Our whole goal is education. So positive reviews are actually the number one thing that help new people discover the show.
You're amazing, and we appreciate it so much.
We'll catch you next time on the Root Cause Medicine Podcast.